The moment the judge said $1 million, the entire room went silent. But the real story started long before that number was ever spoken. The city of Baltimore had seen its share of courtroom drama, but nothing like this. Not a case that began with something so small, so routine, that no one thought it would matter, not until it did. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind where traffic lights blink lazily over crowded intersections and people move through their day without expecting anything to change. Officer Ryan Cole leaned against his patrol car, scanning the street with the kind of confidence that came from years of wearing a badge. To him, the world was simple, patterns were predictable, and certain faces always seemed to fit the description he carried in his mind. And that was when he saw him. Elias Carter stood beside a dark gray sedan parked legally along the curb, dressed in a clean navy jacket, holding a leather folder close to his side. There was nothing unusual about him, nothing threatening, nothing that should have drawn attention. But sometimes, attention doesn't come from facts. It comes from assumptions. Cole straightened, his posture shifting as if something invisible had just confirmed his suspicion. He approached with steady steps, each one carrying authority, each one narrowing the space between perception and reality. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, his voice firm, controlled, unquestioning. Elias turned slowly, not startled, not defensive, just aware. His eyes met the officer's, calm and steady, as if he had seen moments like this before. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone even, almost too even for the situation. That calmness, that lack of fear, only seemed to irritate Cole more. "I asked you to step away," Cole repeated, sharper this time, drawing the attention of a few passing pedestrians who slowed just enough to watch. The air shifted, subtle but real. Elias complied without resistance, placing his folder gently on the hood of the car. "I'm in the middle of something important," he said quietly. "Then you should have thought about that before drawing attention to yourself," Cole replied. Though there had been no disturbance, no complaint, no reason beyond his own instinct. Within minutes, the situation escalated, not through chaos, not through shouting, but through quiet decisions stacking on top of each other. Questions that didn't need to be asked, doubts that didn't need to exist. And then, the moment that would change everything. Cold metal clicked into place around Elias's wrists, not violently, not dramatically, but definitively. Around them, phones began to rise. Eyes locked in. Whispers formed. And still, Elias didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply looked at Officer Cole with a gaze that carried something deeper than frustration, something heavier than anger. "You might want to check your case again," Elias said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the hum of the street. Cole smirked, dismissing it instantly. To him, it was just another line, another excuse, another attempt to avoid consequences. But what he didn't know, what no one there could have known, was that this wasn't just another stop, and Elias Carter wasn't just another man standing on the wrong side of an assumption. Because somewhere inside that leather folder, sitting untouched on the hood of that car, was information tied to a $150,000 case, a case that was about to cost the city nearly 10 times more. And as the patrol car door shut and Elias was placed inside, the sound echoed louder than anyone realized, because it wasn't just the closing of a door. It was the beginning of a mistake that would soon have a price no one in that moment was ready to pay. The inside of the patrol car felt smaller than it should have, not because of the space, but because of the weight of what had just happened, the quiet kind of weight that does not shout but settles in slowly, pressing against every second that passes, and Elias Carter sat there with his hands resting calmly in front of him, his eyes fixed on the blurred movement of the city through the window, watching as people walked by unaware that something irreversible had just begun, not for him, but for the system that believed it understood him, while Officer Ryan Cole settled into the driver's seat with the confidence of someone who believed the situation was already resolved, the radio crackling softly as he reported the arrest in a tone that suggested routine, nothing unusual, nothing worth questioning. And yet, even in that ordinary report, there was a subtle shift, a hesitation that he himself did not notice, because certainty has a way of blinding the person who carries it. And as the car pulled away from the curb, Elias finally spoke again, not loudly, not urgently, but with a measured clarity that seemed almost out of place given the situation. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, his voice steady, and Cole let out a quiet breath through his nose, a dismissive reaction more than a response. "You should have thought about that before," he replied, eyes fixed on the road, as if the conversation itself did not deserve his full attention. But Elias did not push, he did not argue. Instead, he leaned back slightly, allowing silence to fill the space between them, and that silence was not empty. It carried something unresolved, something waiting, and when they arrived at the station, the process unfolded exactly as it always did: paperwork, identification, standard procedure moving forward without interruption, except for one detail that did not fit. When Elias's information was entered into the system, there was a pause, subtle, almost invisible, the kind of pause that only someone paying close attention would notice, and the officer at the desk glanced at the screen, then at Elias, then back again, his brow tightening just slightly before smoothing out as if he had decided not to question it. Not yet, and Cole noticed it too, just for a second, but he chose to ignore it, because doubt would mean reconsidering, and reconsidering would mean admitting that something might be wrong. And that was not a path he was willing to take, not today, not in front of others. So he pushed forward, continuing the booking process, his tone firm, his posture unchanged, while Elias remained composed, answering questions without resistance, offering information without hesitation, but never volunteering more than necessary. And at one point, as the officer reached for the leather folder that had been taken from the car, Elias spoke again, softer this time, but with a precision that cut through the room. "You might want to handle that carefully," he said, and the officer paused mid-motion, glancing at him with mild confusion before opening it anyway, flipping through the contents with casual indifference. But that indifference did not last long, because inside were documents that did not belong in a routine stop: official letters, financial reports, legal filings tied to municipal oversight, numbers and signatures that carried weight far beyond the walls of that station. And the officer's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to suggest that something was not lining up, and for the first time since the arrest began, the room felt different, quieter, more focused, as if the air itself had become aware that something had been overlooked. And Cole noticed it now, the subtle change, the way attention was no longer centered on control but on uncertainty, and he stepped closer, his voice lower, more controlled. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, not expecting a real answer. But Elias met his gaze without hesitation, without fear, and said simply, "That is the case you just turned into something much bigger." And for a brief moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the weight of that sentence had not fully landed yet, but it was already beginning to settle, and somewhere beyond the walls of that station, beyond the paperwork and procedures, something had already been set in motion, something that would not be undone by a report or an explanation, something that would continue forward whether they were ready for it or not. The room did not return to normal after that moment, even though everyone tried to pretend it had. The usual sounds of keyboards clicking and radios murmuring filled the space again, but beneath it there was a tension that had not been there before, subtle but undeniable, like something unseen had just shifted direction. And Officer Ryan Cole felt it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his jaw tightening slightly as he watched the desk officer flip through the documents. Again, slower this time, more carefully, as if the paper itself demanded a different level of respect. And across the counter Elias Carter stood with the same quiet composure, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, not triumphant, not nervous, just patient, as if he had already stepped ahead in a timeline no one else could yet see. And the officer behind the desk cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have. "These documents," he began, hesitating just long enough to draw attention from others nearby. "They are tied to a municipal review case." And the words landed softly but spread quickly, because in a place like that, information does not need to be loud to travel. It just needs to be different. And this was different. Very different from anything that should have been sitting inside a leather folder taken from a routine stop. And Cole stepped forward now, his confidence still present, but no longer as solid as it had been minutes earlier. "It does not change anything," he said, his tone controlled, almost rehearsed, as if repeating it might make it true. But the desk officer did not respond right away. Instead, he turned the folder slightly, angling it so the official seal stamped across one of the pages caught the overhead light. And for a second, that seal said more than any explanation could. It was not just paperwork. It was authority. It was connection. It was something that extended beyond the walls of that building. And Elias finally spoke again. Not to correct, not to argue, but to clarify. Those files are part of an active financial oversight case involving city contracts, he said, each word placed carefully, deliberately, and the room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Because now the situation had moved from uncertainty into something far more dangerous. Implication, and Cole felt it. The shift from control to exposure. Even if he did not yet understand the full shape of it. You are saying you are involved in that? He asked, and there was a slight edge in his voice now. Not anger, but something closer to caution, and Elias nodded once. I am saying that I am directly responsible for reviewing discrepancies tied to that case, he replied, his tone still calm, still measured, but carrying a quiet authority that did not need to raise its volume to be heard. And for the first time since the encounter began, Cole did not immediately respond, because this was no longer about a stop, no longer about suspicion. This was about something that could not be easily dismissed, something that connected to departments, budgets, decisions made far above his rank, and the desk officer shifted again, this time reaching for the phone, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action now required confirmation. And as he dialed, the atmosphere in the room tightened further, conversations fading, attention focusing, and Elias remained exactly where he was, not rushing, not reacting, simply waiting. And in that waiting there was a certainty that had not been there before, a quiet understanding that the moment had already passed the point where it could be contained, and outside, the city continued as it always did, traffic moving, people walking, unaware that inside that station, a single decision had begun to unravel into something much larger, something that would not stay hidden, because once a mistake touches the truth, it does not shrink, it expands. And as the call connected and the first words were spoken on the other end, the system itself had just been invited into the room. The moment the call connected, the tone in the room shifted from uncertainty to quiet urgency, not loud enough to cause panic, but sharp enough to demand attention, and the desk officer straightened slightly as he spoke into the receiver, his words careful, measured, repeating key details as if making sure nothing was misunderstood on the other end. While Officer Ryan Cole stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression tightening with each passing second, because what had started as a simple process was now stretching into something unfamiliar, something he could not control with routine or authority alone. And across from them Elias Carter remained still, his hands resting calmly, his gaze steady, watching not the officers, but the subtle reactions unfolding around him. The way people shifted their posture, the way voices lowered, the way attention began to move away from him as a suspect and toward him as something else entirely. And when the desk officer finally ended the call, he did not immediately speak. Instead, he placed the phone down slowly, as if even that action required thought. And then he looked toward Cole, not with defiance, not with accusation, but with a kind of quiet hesitation that had not been there before. They are sending someone down, he said, and those words landed heavier than expected, because they meant escalation. They meant this situation was no longer contained within the walls of that station. And Cole exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. For what? He asked, though the answer was already forming in the back of his mind, and the officer hesitated again before replying. Internal Affairs wants to review everything. And that was the moment the ground shifted completely, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally, where confidence begins to crack under pressure. And Cole felt it, a subtle tightening in his chest, a flicker of doubt that he quickly tried to push aside. Because admitting doubt would mean admitting possibility, and possibility would mean acknowledging that this was no longer just another arrest. And Elias watched it happen. The shift, the hesitation, the first real sign that the system around him was beginning to question itself. And he spoke again, not to provoke, not to escalate, but to state something that had already become inevitable. This was avoidable, he said quietly, his voice steady, almost reflective, and Cole looked at him sharply. Not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if he was trying to reconcile the situation with the version of reality he had already decided was true. "You are not in a position to tell me that," Cole replied, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier, and Elias did not argue. He simply held his gaze for a moment before looking away, allowing silence to fill the space again. But this time the silence was different, heavier, filled with the weight of consequences that had not yet fully revealed themselves. And across the room, another officer stepped closer to the desk, glancing at the documents still spread out under the fluorescent lights, his eyes scanning the official seals, the signatures, the numbers that no longer looked like paperwork, but like evidence of something far larger, and he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as he spoke to the desk officer, but not low enough to be unheard. "If this ties back to the contract review, this could involve multiple departments," he said, and that sentence moved through the room like a quiet ripple, because now the scope was expanding, moving beyond a single decision, beyond a single officer, into something that touched the structure itself, and Cole heard it, every word, every implication, and for the first time since the encounter began, he did not interrupt. He did not assert control. He simply stood there, processing, as the reality around him began to shift into something he could no longer ignore. And outside, the sky had started to dim slightly, the late afternoon light fading into early evening, casting long shadows through the station windows. And inside those shadows, the situation continued to unfold, slowly, deliberately, as footsteps approached from down the hallway, measured and purposeful, signaling the arrival of people who did not come for routine matters, people who came when something had already gone wrong. And as the door at the end of the corridor opened, the next phase of the story stepped quietly into place, not with noise, not with force, but with the kind of presence that changes everything without needing to say a single word. The footsteps that entered the room did not rush, did not echo with urgency, but carried a deliberate weight that made everyone instinctively straighten just a little, as if something unspoken had just taken authority over the space. And when the two individuals from internal affairs stepped fully into view, their presence did not demand attention. It simply commanded it, their expressions neutral, their movements precise. The kind of composure that came from dealing with situations that had already gone too far to be ignored, and Officer Ryan Cole felt it immediately. That shift from control to observation, from being the one asking questions to the one being quietly assessed, and without raising their voices, without any dramatic introduction, one of them approached the desk, eyes briefly scanning the documents still spread out under the overhead lights before turning to the officer who had made the call. "Walk me through everything from the beginning," he said, his tone calm but firm. And those words did something subtle but irreversible. They reframed the entire situation, not as a routine process, but as an incident. And as the explanation began, step by step, detail by detail, the narrative that had once felt simple started to stretch, revealing gaps, assumptions, moments where decisions had been made without confirmation. And across the room, Elias Carter remained where he was, silent, composed, watching as the story unfolded around him, not through his own words, but through theirs. And there was something almost paradoxical in that, because the more they explained, the less control they seemed to have over what had happened. And Cole listened, his posture rigid, his expression controlled. But beneath that control there was a growing awareness, a realization that the situation was no longer about what he believed had occurred, but about what could be proven. And proof has a way of reshaping everything. And when the explanation reached the point of the stop, the justification, the decision to proceed without additional verification, one of the internal affairs officers raised a hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause the flow, and he turned his attention directly to Cole, his gaze steady. "What was your basis for initiating the stop?" he asked. And it was a simple question, direct, clear, but it carried weight, because it required something more than instinct, more than assumption. It required justification, and Cole responded, his voice measured, outlining his reasoning, the patterns he believed he had observed, the factors that had led him to act. And for a moment, it sounded solid, structured, almost convincing, until it was placed next to the documents, the timeline, the verified information that contradicted it. And that was when the shift became undeniable, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. because the officer did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something that had already been confirmed. And then he said, "We will need to review all related reports, including body camera footage and dispatch logs." And the room seemed to narrow around those words, because now the process had moved beyond conversation into investigation, and investigation does not rely on perspective. It relies on record, and record does not forget. And Elias watched as the weight of that realization settled into the room, the quiet understanding that everything from that moment forward would be documented, analyzed, questioned, and somewhere in that process, the truth would not just surface, it would define the outcome. And Cole felt it now more clearly than before, the loss of certainty, the awareness that this was no longer something that could be managed with confidence alone. And as one of the officers carefully closed the leather folder and held it with a level of attention that had been absent earlier, he turned slightly toward Elias, his tone respectful. "We will make sure this is handled appropriately," he said. And Elias nodded once, not in relief, not in victory, but in acknowledgement, because he understood something that the room was only beginning to grasp, that this moment was not the resolution, it was the transition, the point where a single decision had moved beyond control and into consequence. And once it reached that stage, it no longer belonged to any one person, it belonged to the system itself, and the system had just begun to respond. Time did not stop inside the station, but it began to move differently, slower in some places, faster in others, as if every second now carried more weight than it should, and the process that followed was no longer routine but methodical, deliberate. Each step recorded, each detail preserved, because once something becomes an investigation, nothing is allowed to remain casual. And Officer Ryan Cole felt that shift more clearly with every passing moment, not through words, not through confrontation, but through observation. The way conversations no longer included him, the way glances lingered just a fraction longer than before, the way the authority he once carried so effortlessly now felt like something being quietly measured against a different standard. And across from him, Elias Carter had been uncuffed and asked to sit in a more private area, not as a suspect, but as someone whose presence now required acknowledgement rather than control. And even that small change spoke volumes, because in places like that, status is rarely announced. It is revealed through behavior, through subtle adjustments that signal a shift in understanding. And as the internal affairs officers continued their review, requesting footage, confirming timestamps, cross-checking dispatch records, the narrative that had once seemed straightforward began to fragment, not dramatically, but steadily, like a structure revealing its weaknesses under closer inspection, and every detail that did not align became another point of tension, another indication that something had gone wrong long before anyone realized it. And Cole stood near the edge of the room, no longer leading, no longer directing, simply present as the situation moved beyond him. And for the first time since the encounter began, he replayed the moment in his mind, the initial glance, the decision to approach, the certainty he had felt, and now, in hindsight, that certainty seemed less like confidence and more like assumption. An assumption, once exposed, does not hold its shape, it collapses, and Elias, seated quietly, watched none of this with satisfaction, none of it with visible emotion, because for him this was not unexpected, it was not surprising. It was simply the unfolding of something he had already understood the moment the stop began. And when one of the internal affairs officers approached him again, this time with a notepad in hand, the tone was different, not interrogative, not suspicious, but respectful. "We would like to hear your account of what happened," he said. And Elias nodded once, taking a brief moment before speaking, not to gather his thoughts, but to choose his words carefully. Because in moments like this, clarity matters more than volume. And as he began to explain, his voice remained steady, precise, outlining the sequence of events exactly as they occurred, without exaggeration, without omission, simply presenting the truth as it unfolded. And the more he spoke, the more the pieces began to align, the inconsistencies becoming clearer, the gaps more visible, and somewhere in that process, the room itself seemed to shift again, not physically, but perceptually. Because the story was no longer being constructed, it was being revealed, and Cole listened from a distance, each word landing with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because they did not attack him, they did not accuse him, they simply existed, undeniable, and that made them harder to dismiss. And when Elias finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that follows when something important has just been said, and the officer nodded slowly. "Thank you," he replied, and those two words carried more meaning than they appeared to, because they acknowledged not just cooperation, but credibility. And as the review continued, the atmosphere settled into something quieter, more focused, less reactive, because the direction had been established, the process had begun, and from that point forward, the outcome would no longer depend on interpretation, it would depend on evidence, and evidence, once set in motion, does not bend to perception, it follows its own path, and that path was already leading somewhere far beyond the walls of that station. By the time the evening settled fully over the city, the station no longer felt like the same place it had been just hours earlier, not because the walls had changed, not because the lights had dimmed, but because the narrative inside it had shifted beyond recognition, and what had once been treated as a routine stop was now being examined as a sequence of decisions that carried consequences far beyond a single moment. And the review process had moved into a deeper phase, where every recorded second was no longer just watched but analyzed, paused, replayed, scrutinized, and in one corner of the room a screen displayed the body camera footage, the same footage that had captured the initial interaction in real time, now slowed down, broken apart frame by frame, and as the video played, the difference between perception and reality became impossible to ignore, because what had felt justified in the moment now appeared incomplete, what had seemed certain now looked assumed, and each pause in the footage was followed by quiet notes, subtle exchanges between the internal affairs officers, not loud enough to disrupt the room, but clear enough to signal that conclusions were beginning to form. And Officer Ryan Cole stood nearby, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid, but slightly lowered, as if the weight of observation had begun to press down on him, and he watched the same moments unfold from a perspective he had not considered before, the tone of his own voice, the timing of his actions, the absence of verification. And for the first time, the sequence did not look controlled, it looked premature. And across the room Elias Carter remained seated, his presence no longer central to the investigation, but still deeply connected to its outcome, and he observed without interruption, without reaction, because the process unfolding now was no longer about him proving anything. It was about the system examining itself, and when the footage reached the moment where Elias had placed his folder on the hood of the car, the video paused again, the image frozen on a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, and one of the officers leaned forward slightly, pointing at the frame, not with urgency, but with quiet precision, drawing attention to the placement, the timing, the context that had been overlooked, and another note was written, another piece added to a growing structure of understanding, and the room fell into a deeper silence, not empty, but focused, because everyone present could feel that the direction was becoming clearer, and as the footage continued, the narrative no longer relied on explanation. It revealed itself, each moment aligning with the next until the sequence formed something undeniable, and Cole shifted slightly, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his thoughts moving somewhere else, replaying his own memory against what was now visible, and the difference between the two was no longer small, it was significant, and that realization did not come with noise, it came quietly, settling in with a weight that could not be dismissed, and when the video ended, there was no immediate reaction, no sudden conclusion, just a brief pause, the kind that follows when something important has been fully seen, and then one of the internal affairs officers spoke, his voice calm, steady. "We are going to proceed with a formal review of this incident," he said, and those words carried finality, not in the sense of ending something, but in the sense of beginning something that would not stop until every detail had been accounted for, and Elias lowered his gaze slightly, not in relief, not in victory, but in acknowledgement, because he understood what that meant, that the situation had moved beyond interpretation into process, beyond opinion into record, and once something enters that stage, it no longer depends on belief, it depends on truth, and truth, once documented, does not fade, it expands. And as the officers began organizing the materials, collecting the footage, securing the documents. The system that had once acted with certainty was now responding with caution, and in that shift, the balance had already begun to change, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, because the story was no longer about what had happened, it was about what could be proven, and what could be proven was already starting to speak for itself. The following morning did not arrive with urgency or noise, but with a quiet inevitability, the kind that settles over a city before most people realize something has already begun to unfold, and inside a government building just a few miles from the station. The same case that had started on a sidewalk was now being reviewed in a room far removed from flashing lights and patrol radios, a room where decisions were not made quickly, but carefully, deliberately, with layers of oversight and documentation, and at the center of that room sat a stack of materials that told a story without emotion: body camera footage, dispatch logs, written statements, and the leather folder that had once rested unnoticed on the hood of a car, now placed neatly among official documents, its contents no longer overlooked but examined with the attention they had always required. And as the review progressed, the narrative continued to shift, not through speculation, but through alignment, because when facts begin to connect, they form something stronger than assumption. And one of the senior reviewers leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on a report that outlined the sequence of events in precise detail, each timestamp matching the footage, each action corresponding to a recorded decision. And in that alignment, there was clarity, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable. And across the table, another official adjusted a set of papers, highlighting sections that tied directly to an ongoing financial oversight case involving city contracts, a case that had already been under quiet review for months, and now, unexpectedly, it intersected with something else, something that should never have crossed its path. And that intersection was not minor. It carried implications, because it suggested that an individual directly connected to that review had been detained without sufficient cause. And in a system built on procedure, that kind of misstep does not remain isolated, it expands. And as the discussion continued, the focus moved beyond the initial stop and into its broader impact, the potential delay of an active investigation, the exposure of sensitive materials, the procedural failures that allowed it to happen. And with each point raised, the scope widened, not just a mistake, but a chain reaction, and somewhere within that process, the financial aspect began to take shape, not as a number pulled from thin air, but as a calculation: the cost of disruption, the cost of liability, the cost of trust, all measured against policies that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. And as those numbers were quietly outlined, they did not need to be emphasized to carry weight, because everyone in the room understood what they represented, not just currency, but consequence. And while that discussion unfolded miles away, back at the station, Officer Ryan Cole sat alone in a small office, no longer surrounded by activity, no longer part of the process, but waiting, the kind of waiting that does not come with a timeline, only with uncertainty. And for the first time since the encounter began, there was no action to take, no decision to make, only reflection. And in that reflection, the moments replayed again, but differently now, not through the lens of confidence, but through the lens of scrutiny, and each detail that had once seemed insignificant now carried meaning. And across the city, Elias Carter walked out of the building where he had been asked to provide additional information, his steps measured, his posture unchanged, but the weight of the situation no longer resting on him, because it had already moved beyond him, into systems, into processes, into structures that would determine what came next. And as he stepped into the morning light, he did not look back, not out of dismissal, but out of understanding, because once something reaches that level, it no longer needs to be watched to continue. It moves forward on its own. And inside those rooms, behind closed doors and quiet conversations, the outcome was already beginning to form, not as a reaction, but as a result, shaped by facts, guided by process, and driven by something far more powerful than assumption, the kind of truth that does not raise its voice, but changes everything once it is seen. The decision was not announced with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It arrived the way most irreversible outcomes do, quietly, through a document placed on a table, reviewed one final time, and then signed. and inside that room the atmosphere remained steady, controlled. But beneath that control there was a clear understanding that what had just been finalized would extend far beyond those walls. Because it was not just a conclusion, it was a consequence shaped by every detail that had come before it. And as the final page was set aside, one of the senior officials spoke, his tone calm, measured. "The city will move forward with a settlement," he said, and though the number had already been discussed, already calculated, hearing it confirmed carried a different kind of weight, not because of its size alone, but because of what it represented, a measurable cost tied directly to a series of decisions that should have been different. And as the meeting concluded, there was no celebration, no reaction beyond quiet acknowledgement, because outcomes like this are not victories, they are corrections, attempts to restore balance after something has already been disrupted. And miles away, inside a small administrative office, Officer Ryan Cole sat across from a supervisor, the space around him stripped of the usual movement and noise that once defined his role, replaced instead by stillness. And as the conversation unfolded, it did not need to be lengthy. It did not need to be forceful, because everything that needed to be understood had already been documented, reviewed, confirmed. And when the supervisor finished speaking, outlining the result of the investigation, the procedural failures, the consequences that would follow, Cole did not interrupt. He did not argue, because there was nothing left to challenge, only something to accept. And in that acceptance there was a quiet realization, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, that the moment he had acted without verification had not just been a decision, it had been a turning point, one that carried effects he had never intended but could no longer deny. And across the city, Elias Carter stood outside a municipal building, the same leather folder now resting securely in his hand, its contents unchanged, but its significance no longer hidden. And as he stepped down the concrete stairs, the morning light reflecting softly off the glass behind him, there was no sense of triumph in his expression, no visible satisfaction, only a calm understanding that what had unfolded was never about proving a point. It was about allowing the truth to surface on its own terms. And as he walked forward, blending back into the rhythm of the city, the story that had once centered on him no longer required his presence to continue, because it had already reached the systems that would carry it forward. And back in that quiet room where the decision had been made, the signed document remained on the table, a simple piece of paper that now held the weight of accountability. And while the number attached to it would be discussed, reported, analyzed, the deeper impact would not be measured in dollars alone. It would be measured in awareness, in policy changes, in the subtle shifts that occur when a system